A wall is not a thing you build to keep something out. A wall is a thing you build to keep something in. This is not philosophy, it is carpentry. It is the difference between a woman who builds because she is afraid of what is coming and a woman who builds because she has already lost what mattered most and has sworn on the blood that soaked into the snow on a January night that she will not lose anything else. The first kind of wall is a fence. The second kind is a fortress. And the woman who stood at the edge of the tree line in the Bitterroot Valley of western Montana in the autumn of 1886, looking at the cabin her dead husband had built with his own hands, from ponderosa pine he had felled and dragged and peeled and notched and raised without help, from any living soul, was not building a fence. Her name was Hadley Corwin. She was 38 years old. She stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, and she weighed 130 pounds, and she had the kind of build that comes from a lifetime of work that does not stop when the body asks it to. Broad across the shoulders for a woman, narrow at the waist, hands that were rough and square, and scarred across the knuckles from a childhood spent in her father's blacksmith shop in Dayton, Ohio, where she had learned before she was 10 years old that iron does what you tell it to do if you heat it enough and hit it right, and that stone does what you tell it to do if you stack it plumb and mortar it true, and that wood does what you tell it to do if you cut it with the grain and join it square. She had brown hair that she wore in a single braid down her back tied with a strip of leather. She had gray eyes that did not change color with the light, the way some gray eyes do, but stayed the same flat pewter in sun and shade alike, the kind of eyes that look at a thing and see it for what it is without adding anything or taking anything away. She had a jaw that was set most of the time in the particular way that a jaw sets when the person behind it has made a decision and is not interested in discussing it. She had been married to Boone Corwin for 4 years. She had been a widow for 2 years and 9 months. She had not remarried. She had not left the cabin. She had not sold the land. She had not done any of the things that the settlement in the Bitterroot Valley expected a widow of 38 to do when the man who had built her house and cleared her pasture and promised her a life in the mountains of Montana was lying under a pine cross on the ridge above the creek where the snow melted last in spring. The cabin stood in a clearing at the base of a timbered slope, surrounded on 3 sides by ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, with a meadow opening to the south toward Birch Creek and the valley floor beyond. Boone Corwin had built it in the spring and summer of 1880, the year they arrived from Ohio. He had been a carpenter by trade and a craftsman by temperament, a man who measured twice and cut once, not because the saying told him to, but because cutting twice offended something in him that he could not have named, but that governed every joint he made. The cabin was 16 feet wide and 20 feet long. The walls were 8-inch ponderosa logs peeled and notched at the corners in a saddle notch that locked each log to the one below it without spikes or pins. The roof was pole rafters covered with hand-split cedar shakes. The floor was puncheon, half logs laid flat side up on sleepers, planed smooth with a broad axe until the surface was even enough to walk on without catching a heel. He had built a stone fireplace against the north wall, laid up from creek stone and river cobble in lime mortar. He had mixed himself from limestone he had burned in a kiln he had built from the same creek stone. The chimney drew clean, and the firebox threw heat into the room in the way that a well-built firebox does, which is to say, it threw the heat forward and upward instead of sending it up the chimney, because Boone had angled the fire back at 11 degrees from vertical, which is the angle that reflects radiant heat into the room, instead of letting it rise straight up the flue. He had explained the angle to Hadley on the evening he finished the firebox, standing in the half-built cabin, with mortar dust on his shirt and his hands gray with ash. And she had listened the way she always listened to Boone when he talked about the way things were built, which was with the particular attention of a woman who understood construction from her own childhood and who recognized in her husband a mind that thought in angles and joints and load-bearing lines the way some minds think in words. Boone Corwin died on the 14th of January, 1884. He died at 2 in the morning in a blizzard that came down out of Canada with a wind that the old-timers in the valley said was the worst they had heard since '68. The temperature dropped to 22 below zero. The wind was clocked at 50 miles per hour at the stage station in Stevensville, 12 miles south, and the wind at the cabin was probably higher because the cabin sat at the base of a slope that funneled the northwest wind into a channel between two ridges and accelerated it the way water accelerates when a creek narrows between two rocks. At 2 in the morning, the wind took a ponderosa pine. The tree was 70 feet tall and perhaps 18 inches at the base, and it stood 40 feet west of the cabin, and it had been dead for 2 seasons, killed by bark beetles the summer before, and its root plate had rotted in the wet autumn of '83, and the wind found the weakness in the roots. The way wind always finds weakness, which is by pressing until something gives. The tree came down across the cabin. It came down at an angle, the trunk striking the west wall at the midpoint between the corner post and the window, and the 8-inch ponderosa logs of the wall were strong, but they were not strong enough to stop a 70-foot tree driven by a 50-mile wind. The trunk punched through the wall as if the wall were paper. It came through the lozza and into the room, and it crossed the room at a height of 4 feet above the floor, which was the height of the bed where Hadley and Boone were sleeping. Boone heard the tree coming. A man who has spent his life working with wood knows the sound of wood failing. He knows it the way a mother knows the sound of her child's cry from 3 rooms away instantly, without thought, without the intervening step of deciding what the sound means. He heard the crack of the roots letting go. He heard the groan of the trunk beginning to fall. He had perhaps 2 seconds. He rolled toward Hadley. He put his body over hers. He pressed her down into the mattress with his chest and his arms and his weight. The tree came through the wall, and it struck him across the back and the shoulders with a force that broke his spine in 3 places and crushed his ribs into his lungs, and he did not make a sound when it hit him, because the impact drove the air out of his body before his throat could use it. Hadley was beneath him. The tree was above him. She could feel his weight on her and the weight of the tree on him, and the cold wind pouring through the hole in the wall and the snow coming in with the wind, horizontal driving, filling the room with white. She could feel his blood on her face. She could feel it on her neck and her chest and her arms. She could feel it soaking into the mattress beneath them. She spoke his name. She spoke it 3 times. The 3rd time she knew he was not going to answer because the weight on her had changed. The weight of a living man on a woman's body is different from the weight of a dead man on a woman's body, and she knew the difference before she had finished saying his name the 3rd time. She lay beneath him for an hour. She lay beneath him because the tree had pinned them both to the bed and she could not move, and because even if she could have moved, she was not yet willing to move because moving would have meant lifting herself out from under the body of the man she had married in Ohio when she was 34 years old and had followed to Montana because he said the mountains were the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and she had believed him, and he had been right. She lay beneath him, and she felt the blood cooling on her skin, and she listened to the wind in the broken wall, and she did not cry because the cold had taken her tears before they could form. At 3 in the morning, she freed herself. She worked her body sideways, inch by inch, out from under Boone's weight and the weight of the tree. She stood in the wrecked room in her nightgown with the wind blowing snow through a hole in the wall that was 6 feet wide and the temperature inside the cabin at 9 degrees below zero, and her husband dead on the bed with a ponderosa pine across his back. She built up the fire. She blocked the hole in the wall with the kitchen table turned its on its side and every blanket and quilt and piece of fabric she could find in the cabin. She dragged the mattress to the fireplace, and she lay down beside the fire, and she waited for dawn. In the morning, she pulled Boone out from under the tree. She wrapped him in the quilt her mother had made for their wedding. She dragged him on a canvas tarp to the ridge above the creek. She dug a grave in frozen ground with a pick and a shovel. It took her 2 days. The ground was frozen to 14 inches, and below the frost line, the clay was so hard that the pick bounced when it struck. She dug until her hands bled through the gloves, and she kept digging because there was no one else to dig, and because the body could not stay in the cabin, and because a man who had built a house with his own hands deserved to be buried by hands that loved him, and not by the impersonal labor of men hired from town who had never heard him laugh. She buried him on the 16th of January. She stood at the grave in the wind with the pine cross she had made from 2 pieces of ponderosa she had cut and squared and mortised together the way Boone would have done it, with a joint that would hold without nails, and she set the cross at the head of the grave, and she said what she had to say, which was not a prayer and not a eulogy but a promise. The promise was short. The promise was that she would not leave this place. The promise was that she would not let another tree come through another wall. The promise was that what had happened on the 14th of January would not happen again, not to her, not to anyone who sheltered under a roof she was responsible for. She made the promise to the pine cross and to the frozen ground and to the wind, and then she walked back down the ridge to the cabin, and she began to repair the wall. She repaired the wall. She felt a ponderosa of the right diameter. She peeled it and notched it and fitted it into the gap where the dead tree had come through. She chinked the joints with moss and mud and pine pitch. The wall was whole again by the end of the month. The cabin was weather tight. The fire drew clean. The bed was back in its place, though she did not sleep in it. She slept on the floor beside the fireplace for 6 months before she could sleep in the bed again. And when she finally did sleep in the bed, it was on Boone's side because her own side was where the blood had been, and she could not bring herself to lie on the side where the blood had been. 20 months passed. She lived. She worked. She cut wood and hauled water and tended the small vegetable garden Boone had laid out on the south side of the cabin, and she put up preserves in the autumn, and she hunted elk in November, and she did everything that Boone had done and everything she had done, and she did it alone because there was no one to do it with. The neighbors in the Bitterroot Valley knew she was there. They knew she was alone. They brought food in the first months after the funeral, and they offered help, and she accepted the food and declined the help not out of pride, but out of the understanding that help that comes with conditions is not help but obligation, and she was not willing to be obligated to anyone for the maintenance of the life she and Boone had built. In September of 1886, 20 months after Boone's death, Hadley Corwin walked the perimeter of her cabin 112 times. She walked it in the morning, and she walked it in the evening, and she walked it at midday when the September sun was warm on the meadow grass and the elk were bugling on the ridges above the valley. She walked it measuring. She was measuring the distance from the cabin wall to the nearest standing tree. She was measuring the height of the nearest standing tree. She was measuring the angle at which a tree of that height, falling from that distance, would strike the cabin wall, and the force with which it would strike, and the thickness of wall that would be required to stop it. She had done these calculations before. She had done them in her head while lying on the floor beside the fireplace in the months after Boone's death. She had done them the way her father had taught her to do calculations about iron and stone by working backward from the result she wanted. The result she wanted was a wall that could not be penetrated by a falling ponderosa pine driven by a 50-mile wind. The result she wanted was a wall between her cabin and the world. She started building on the 1st of October. She started with stone. The creek bed below the cabin was full of granite cobble, round stones the size of a man's head, and larger washed down from the mountains over 10,000 years, and deposited in the gravel bars where the creek slowed on the bends. She hauled the stones in a wooden sledge that Boone had built for dragging fence posts, 20 stones per load, 4 loads per day every day for 2 weeks. She stacked the stones along the west side of the cabin first, because the west side was where the tree had come through, and the west side was where the wind hit hardest, and the west side was where she had lain beneath her husband's body and listened to his blood cooling on her skin. The wall was 6 feet tall. The base was 3 feet wide, tapering to 18 inches at the top. She laid the stones in courses the way her father had taught her to lay brick, each course offset from the one below, so that no vertical joint ran through more than one course. She packed the joints with a mortar of mud and pine pitch and dried grass, a frontier mortar that would not hold forever but would hold long enough, and she tamped each course with a flat stone before laying the next. The wall was not beautiful. It was not the kind of wall a mason would have built, but it was plumb and it was solid, and when she leaned against it with her full weight, it did not move, and when she struck it with the flat of a shovel, it did not crack, and when she laid her hand against it in the evening, she could feel the day's heat radiating back out of the stone into the cooling air, which told her the wall had mass, and mass was what she needed because mass is what stops a moving object. Mass and nothing else. She built the wall around the entire cabin, west side first, then north, then east, then south. 6 feet tall, 3 feet wide at the base, 18 inches at the top, laid in courses of creek granite mortared with mud and pitch. The wall took 6 weeks. She finished it on the 15th of November, 1 week before the first snow. The settlement noticed everything on Birch Creek because the settlement was 9 families scattered across 6,000 acres of valley and bench land, and anything one family did was visible to 3 others, and anything visible to 3 was known by all 9 before the week was out. The wall was visible. It was 6 feet of stacked stone surrounding a ponderosa cabin in a meadow, and it looked like nothing anyone in the Bitterroot Valley had ever built, because no one in the Bitterroot Valley had ever needed to build it, because no one in the Bitterroot Valley had ever lain beneath a dead man in a broken wall and promised the wind that it would not happen again. Ephraim Jessup was the first to speak. Ephraim Jessup owned the largest ranch in the valley, 460 acres of grass and timber on the east side of Birch Creek, running 120 head of cattle and 40 horses. He was 55 years old that autumn, a tall man with a white mustache in the particular bearing of a man who has been the most prosperous person in a small community for long enough that he has forgotten what it feels like to be uncertain about anything. He stood inside Grogan's store in Corvallis on a Saturday morning in November with a cup of coffee in his hand, and he said what the settlement had been thinking for 6 weeks. "She has built a wall around her cabin," Ephraim said. "A stone wall, 6 feet tall. What does she think she is doing? Does she think she is building a fortress?" The men in the store murmured. One of them, a farmer named Orrin Suttree, whose place bordered the south end of Hadley's parcel, said she was a good woman, but she had been alone too long. Another, a man named Calvin Fentress, whose place was 2 miles up the creek, said she had always been peculiar, and the wall was proof of it. "Maybe she is trying to keep the bears out," someone said, and the men laughed. Maybe she is trying to keep the loneliness in, someone else said, and the men laughed again. But the laughter was shorter this time because the second joke was closer to the truth than anyone wanted to admit. And jokes that are close to the truth have a shorter life than jokes that are not. Ephraim drank his coffee. He said she is wasting her time and her labor. One wall of stacked stone will not stop a Montana winter. She would be better off selling the land to someone who knows what to do with it and moving to town. The men nodded, the subject changed, but the judgment had been entered, and the judgment was the judgment of a community that understood walls of a certain kind, the kind that kept cattle in and predators out, the kind that defined property lines and marked boundaries, and that did not understand a wall of a different kind, the kind that a woman builds around a broken place because the breaking had cost her everything, and she had sworn it would not cost her anything else. 1 week after Ephraim spoke at the store, a man named Colton Breyer rode up the creek road to Hadley's cabin on a bay horse with new shoes and a saddle that had been oiled recently and well. Colton Breyer was 28 years old. He had come to the Bitterroot Valley from Helena 6 months earlier, and what he did in Helena was a matter of occasional discussion in the settlement, but no one knew for certain. He called himself a land agent. He carried a leather valise with brass fittings, and he wore a coat that fit him and boots that were new, and he had the particular ease of manner that comes to a man who has learned in a city that most people want to be liked, and that a man who seems to like them can get them to agree to things they would not agree to if he seemed indifferent. He dismounted at the gate in the stone wall. He stood outside the wall and he looked at it for a long moment, running his hand along the top course of stone, feeling the mortar, testing the weight of the construction with his palm. Then he called out. Hadley came to the gate. She did not open it. She stood on her side of the wall and she looked at Colton Breyer on his side of the wall, and she waited. He introduced himself. He said he represented certain interests in Helena who were looking to acquire ranch land in the Bitterroot Valley. He said he had identified her parcel as one of the more promising properties in the area. He said he understood that a woman alone in the mountains might find the burdens of ranch life challenging, particularly in winter, and that his clients were prepared to offer a fair price for the property, including all improvements. He named a figure, $600. He said she could take the money and resettle in Corvallis or Missoula, where life would be easier and the winters would be shorter and the company would be better. Hadley listened. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she said, "The winters are the same length in Corvallis as they are here, Mr. Breyer, and the company is already as good as I need it to be." She did not say no. She said something that was worse than no, which was that she had not heard anything worth responding to. Colton Breyer understood the difference. He smiled the smile of a man who has been turned down before and who does not consider a refusal permanent. He said he would leave his card, and he produced a printed card from his valise, and he set it on the top of the wall, and the card sat there in the November wind and did not blow away because the mortar was rough enough to hold it. Montana winters change people's minds, he said. He tipped his hat. He mounted his horse. He rode back down the creek road. Hadley picked up the card. She looked at it. She put it in her apron pocket. She went back inside the wall, and she stood in the space between the wall and the cabin, and she looked at the cabin, and she looked at the wall, and she thought about the tree that had come through the west side 2 winters ago, and she thought about the angle of the trunk and the height of the impact point and the thickness of the logs that had failed to stop it. She went to bed that night, and she did not sleep. She lay in the bed on Boone's side, and she listened to the November wind, and she thought about the wall she had built and the wall she had not built yet. In the morning she got up. She dressed. She walked outside. She stood in the meadow on the west side of the cabin, and she looked at the stone wall, and she looked at the standing ponderosa pines beyond the wall, and she measured with her eye the distance between the wall and the nearest tree, and she measured the height of the tree, and she calculated the force of the fall, and she understood that the wall she had built was not enough. She began the second wall the next day. She built it 3 feet outside the first wall. The second wall was the same height, 6 feet, and the same construction, creek granite, in mud and pitch mortar. But the space between the two walls, the 3 foot gap that separated the inner wall from the outer wall, she filled with something different. She filled it with dried grass and pine straw and packed earth layered in courses, the way insulation is layered in a well-built house, creating a dead air space within a solid mass that would serve two purposes at once. The outer wall would stop any physical impact, a falling tree, a driven branch, a rolling boulder dislodged by frost. The inner wall would hold heat, and the dead space between them, packed with dry fiber and earth, would stop the cold. The principle was not complicated. Hadley had understood it since she was a girl in her father's shop in Ohio, watching him build a forge with double walls of brick and a layer of sand between them. The double wall does not conduct heat from one side to the other because the dead space breaks the path. Cold cannot travel through still air trapped between two solid surfaces the way it travels through a single solid surface. A cabin with 8-inch log walls and a single stone wall outside them will lose heat through the stone because stone conducts cold. But a cabin with 8-inch log walls and two stone walls outside them, separated by 3 feet of packed dry fiber, will hold its heat the way a closed fist holds a coin. The neighbors saw the second wall going up, and the laughter that had been murmured in Grogan's store became spoken aloud on the road, and at the watering places, and at the Sunday gathering at the schoolhouse, where the circuit preacher held services once a month. Nettie Jessup, Ephraim's wife, said it plainly to a circle of women at the schoolhouse on the last Sunday in November. "She is building a castle for one," Nettie said. "What is next? A moat and a drawbridge." The women laughed. Hadley was not at the schoolhouse because Hadley did not attend the Sunday gatherings, not because she objected to the preaching, but because she objected to the hour and a half of socializing that followed, during which the settlement's opinions were formed and distributed and reinforced, and she did not wish to be present for the forming and distributing and reinforcing of opinions about her wall. She worked through November. She worked through December. She finished the second wall on the 23rd of December, 2 days before Christmas, and she stood in the meadow in the late afternoon light, and she looked at what she had built. Two concentric walls of creek granite, 6 feet tall, encircling the cabin, in a double ring of stone with 3 feet of packed insulation between them. The outer wall was rough and solid and gray in the winter light. The inner wall was tighter and smoother, its mortar packed with more care, its courses more even, because the inner wall was the one she would see every day, and she wanted it to be right. She had cut a gate in the south wall, the side that faced the meadow and the creek, and she had hung a heavy plank door on iron hinges she had forged herself on the small anvil Boone had kept in the lean-to behind the cabin. The door swung inward between the two walls, and when it was closed, the double wall was unbroken on all four sides, and the cabin sat inside it the way a heart sits inside a chest, protected from every direction by mass and air and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had made a promise to a pine cross on a ridge and intended to keep it. On the evening of the 23rd of December, she heard a sound outside the south gate. She went to the gate. She opened it. The meadow was empty in the December twilight, but at the base of the gate, on the frozen ground outside the outer wall, 3 things had been placed in a neat pile: a coil of heavy gauge iron wire, a wooden-handled draw knife with a new edge, and a smoked elk roast wrapped in muslin, perhaps 4 pounds, enough for a week if eaten carefully. She looked down the creek road toward the Hewitt place 3/4 of a mile south. Doss Hewitt's chimney was smoking. She could see the light in his window. She could see no figure on the road between his house and hers. She picked up the wire and the draw knife and the elk roast. She carried them inside the wall. She closed the gate. She stood in the space between the two walls with the tools and the food in her arms, and she understood that somewhere in the Bitterroot Valley, there was a 74-year-old man who had been watching her build for 3 months and who had decided without a word spoken and without a word expected in return that what she was building was worth the building and that the woman who was building it deserved a draw knife and a coil of wire and 4 pounds of smoked elk. She did not walk down to the Hewitt place to say thank you. She understood that a man who leaves gifts at a gate without knocking is a man who does not want to be thanked. She cooked a piece of the elk roast on the fireplace that evening. She ate it at the table that Boone had built from ponderosa planks at the place where she always sat, which was across from the place where Boone had always sat, and the empty chair was still there and would always be there because she was not going to move it, and she was not going to fill it, and she was not going to pretend that the man who had sat in it was not still sitting in it every evening in the part of her mind where the dead go on living after they have stopped. She ate her supper, she banked the fire, she checked the gate, she walked the perimeter of the outer wall in the dark, running her hand along the cold stone, feeling the mass of it, feeling the solidity, feeling the wall, do what a wall does when a woman puts her hand on it, which is to say it held. She went inside. She lay down on Boone's side of the bed. She pulled the quilt her mother had made over her shoulders. She listened to the December wind hitting the outer wall, and she listened to the sound the wind made when it hit the wall, which was a sound like a hand slapping stone, and she listened to what the wind sounded like after it hit the wall, which was nothing because the wall stopped it and the 3 feet of packed fiber between the walls absorbed what was left. And the inner wall held the silence in the cabin inside. The silence held the heat. And Hadley Corwin lay in her bed in a cabin inside 2 walls of stone in the Bitterroot Valley of Montana, and she listened to the nothing that the wind became when it met her work, and she closed her eyes. The winter of 1886 came into the Bitterroot Valley the way a man walks into a room he intends to own. Slowly at first, a few inches of snow in late November, a hard frost in the first week of December that killed the last of the meadow grass and turned the mud along the creek road into iron. Then faster. A foot of snow on the 12th of December, another 8 inches on the 19th. The temperature dropping 5 degrees a day through the 3rd week of the month until the thermometer on the south wall of Hadley's cabin, the one Boone had narrowed there the first autumn they lived on the place, read 4 degrees above zero on Christmas morning and did not rise above 10 for 3 days after. Hadley had been preparing since September. She had known this winter was coming the way a woman knows certain things without being told, not by reading signs or listening to old-timers, but by paying attention to the weight of the air and the color of the sky and the particular way the elk moved on the ridges in early autumn, higher than usual, faster than usual, with the urgency of animals that can feel something in the earth that human feet cannot. She had started cutting firewood in the 2nd week of September before she began the first wall, and she had not stopped cutting through the wall building and after it. She cut ponderosa pine because ponderosa burns hot and slow and splits clean along the grain. She felled the trees with a crosscut tool. She worked alone using a wedge and a sledgehammer to start the cut and the saw to finish it, and she bucked the trunks into 18-inch rounds and split the rounds with a maul and stacked the splits in a rick against the inside face of the inner wall where the stone would keep the rain off. and the air would circulate between the stacked pieces, and the wood would season in the weeks before she needed to burn it. She cut 3 full cords. 3 cords of ponderosa is roughly 12,000 pounds of wood, and she moved every pound of it herself from the stump to the sledge to the splitting block to the rick. And by the time she finished, her shoulders were broader than they had been in September, and her hands were harder, and the blisters on her palms had broken and healed and broken and healed until the skin beneath them was as thick as saddle leather. 3 cords was more firewood than any single household in the Bitterroot Valley had ever put up for a winter. Ephraim Jessup, who heated the largest house in the valley, a 6-room frame dwelling with a parlor stove, and 2 fireplaces, put up 2 cords and considered himself well prepared. The Suttree family put up 1.5 cords. The Fentress family put up 1.25 cords and supplemented it by cutting deadfall through the winter as they needed it. Hadley put up 3 cords because she had calculated the heat loss of a cabin with 8-inch log walls inside a double stone wall, and she had calculated the burn rate of ponderosa in a firebox angled at 11 degrees, and she had calculated the number of days between the first hard freeze and the last hard freeze in a Montana winter, which was 140 days in a normal year and 170 in a bad one. And she had multiplied the burn rate by the number of days and added 20%, because her father had taught her to add 20% to any calculation involving weather, and the answer was 3 cords. The food came next. She had been growing vegetables on the south side of the cabin since the first summer she and Boone had arrived, a garden plot 40 feet long and 12 feet wide that Boone had cleared and fenced with split rail to keep the deer out. She grew corn beans, squash tomatoes, potatoes, carrots, and turnips, the standard Montana homestead garden, and she grew it well because she had been gardening since Ohio, and because the soil along Birch Creek was black and deep, and the growing season in the Bitterroot, though short, was intense, with 18 hours of sunlight in late June that could push a tomato plant from blossom to fruit in 3 weeks. She had canned in every autumn since she arrived, but in the autumn of 1886, she canned with a purpose that went beyond habit. She put up 200 jars, tomatoes whole and stewed, green beans in salt brine, corn cut from the cob and packed in jars with a tablespoon of sugar per quart, carrots sliced and pickled in vinegar, squash mashed and sealed with wax, potatoes cubed and packed in water. She filled every jar she owned, and she traded 3 quilts she had pieced through the summer for 30 more jars from Grogan's store in Corvallis, and she filled those too. She lined the jars on shelves Boone had built along the north wall of the cabin, 3 shelves, each one 8 feet long, and the jars sat on the shelves in rows, catching the light from the south window, red and green and gold and amber, and they looked to Hadley like a promise made in glass, a promise that she would eat through whatever was coming. She hunted in October. She shot a bull elk on the ridge above the cabin on the morning of the 14th, a 6-point bull that dressed out at 420 pounds. She hung the carcass from the ridge pole of the lean-to behind the cabin, and she butchered it herself over 2 days, cutting steaks and roasts and stew meat, and packing the cuts in salt in the wooden barrel Boone had made for the purpose. She smoked the ribs and the neck meat over a slow fire of green alder in the smokehouse she and Boone had built in their second summer, a small log structure 6 feet square with a stone firebox and a chimney that drew the smoke up through racks of meat hung from the ceiling on iron hooks. The smoked meat would keep through the winter without refrigeration. The salted meat would keep in the barrel as long as the salt held and the barrel stayed sealed. She sealed the cabin. She went over every joint and every chink in the log walls with a mixture of moss and mud and pine pitch, pressing the material into the gaps with a flat stick and smoothing it with her thumb until no gap wider than a knife blade remained. She stuffed the gaps around the door frame with strips of wool blanket cut into narrow rolls and tamped into the cracks with a chisel. She hung a second door inside the first door she built from ponderosa planks and deer hide, creating an airlock between the two doors that would trap the cold air when she entered and prevent it from rushing into the heated room. She built double windows. The cabin had 4 windows, each one 18 inches wide and 24 inches tall, glazed with single panes of glass that Boone had freighted in from Missoula on a wagon the first autumn. Single glass in a Montana winter is almost worse than no glass at all because glass conducts cold faster than wood and radiates it into the room like a sheet of ice hung on the wall. Hadley built a second frame for each window set 2 inches inside the first frame, and she glazed the second frame with glass she had traded for at Grogan's store, 6 panes at 40 cents each, the most expensive purchase she had made since Boone's death. The 2-inch air gap between the 2 panes of glass created a dead air space that cut the heat loss through the windows by more than half. She sealed the edges of the inner frames with strips of wool blanket soaked in tallow, and when she pressed her hand against the inner pane on a December morning with the temperature outside at 10 degrees, the glass was cool but not cold, and no frost had formed on the interior surface, which told her the dead airspace was working. The cabin was ready. 3 cords of seasoned firewood stacked against the inner wall, 200 jars of preserved vegetables on the shelves, 400 pounds of salted and smoked elk in the barrel and the smokehouse, every crack sealed, double doors hung, double windows glazed, a stone fireplace with an 11-degree fireback that threw heat into the room like a stove, and outside surrounding all of it, 2 concentric walls of creek granite 6 feet tall with 3 feet of packed dry fiber between them, enclosing the cabin in a double ring of stone that would stop a falling tree and hold the heat and keep the wind from touching the walls of the house that Boone Corwin had built with his own hands. On the 2nd of January 1887, Colton Breyer came back. He did not come alone. He rode up the creek road at mid-morning with a second man on a second horse, a thin man in a dark coat who carried a leather portfolio under his arm and who dismounted at the gate of the outer wall with the careful movements of a man who does not ride often and who is conscious of his own discomfort. The thin man was a lawyer from Helena. His name was Pardee. He had a narrow face and pale hands, and the particular expression of a man who has been brought to a place he does not wish to be in order to do a thing he does not wish to do, but for which he is being paid well enough to override his reluctance. Colton Breyer dismounted with his usual ease. He stood outside the gate, and he called out, and Hadley came to the gate, and she saw the 2 men and the 2 horses and the leather portfolio, and she understood, before anyone had spoken, what the portfolio was for. Colton removed his hat. He said, "Good morning." He said he was sorry to trouble her. He said Mr. Pardee was an attorney who specialized in land title matters and who had been engaged to review the status of certain parcels in the Bitterroot Valley, including hers. He said Mr. Pardee had identified an irregularity in the survey of the Corwin parcel, a discrepancy between the boundary description in the original filing and the boundary markers as they existed on the ground. He said the discrepancy was significant enough to cast doubt on the validity of the title and that his clients in Helena were prepared to resolve the matter quietly and amicably if Mrs. Corwin was willing to discuss terms. Hadley did not open the gate. She stood behind it. She looked at Colton Breyer, and she looked at the lawyer Pardee, and she looked at the leather portfolio. She said, "Wait here." She walked to the cabin. She went inside. She was inside for perhaps 2 minutes. When she came out, she was carrying a wooden document case, flat and rectangular, that Boone had made from walnut and that she kept on the shelf beside the bed. She carried the case to the gate. She opened it. She drew out a folded sheet of paper, heavy paper, the kind used for official documents, and she unfolded it and held it up so that both men could see it. The paper was the original survey plat of the Corwin parcel drawn by the county surveyor in the spring of 1882, 4 years before. The plat showed the boundaries of the 160-acre homestead claim in metes and bounds, with the survey markers described by bearing and distance from a section corner monument. The plat bore the signature of the county surveyor and the stamp of the General Land Office in Washington, and the date of the filing, which was the 14th of April, 1882. Hadley said, "Mr. Breyer, this is the original survey filed by my husband at the county courthouse in 1882. The boundaries are correct. The markers are where the surveyor placed them. I walked the lines myself last spring and confirmed every marker. If Mr. Pardee has found a discrepancy, the discrepancy is in his reading and not in the survey." She folded the paper. She put it back in the case. She closed the case. She held it at her side. Pardee the lawyer opened his portfolio. He produced a sheet of paper of his own. He began to say something about the legal standard for boundary disputes in Montana Territory and the procedures for filing a challenge. Hadley interrupted him. She did not raise her voice. She said, "Mr. Pardee, I do not know who is paying you, and I do not care. This land was surveyed by the county. This land was filed at the courthouse. This land was patented by the General Land Office. If you or your client wish to challenge the title, you may do so in court in Missoula, and I will meet you there with this document and the testimony of the county surveyor, who is still living in Corvallis, and who will confirm every line on this plat. I wish you both a safe ride home." She turned. She walked back to the cabin. She went inside. She closed the door. Colton Breyer stood at the gate for perhaps 30 seconds. He looked at the lawyer. The lawyer looked at the portfolio in his hands. The lawyer closed the portfolio. He said quietly so that only Colton could hear, "The survey is clean. The plat is registered. There is no case." Colton put his hat back on. He looked at the cabin inside the double wall. He looked at the stone. He looked at the gate. He looked at the chimney smoke rising straight in the still winter air. He mounted his horse. He said over his shoulder to no one in particular, "We will see each other again after winter." The two men rode back down the creek road. Hadley watched them from the south window. She watched until they were around the bend and out of sight. Then she put the document case back on the shelf. She sat down at the table. She put her hands flat on the ponderosa planks. Her hands were shaking. They had not been shaking at the gate. They had not been shaking when she held the survey plat up for the two men to read. They were shaking now in the privacy of her own kitchen, because the privacy of her own kitchen was the only place she allowed her hands to shake. She sat until the shaking stopped. Then she got up. She added wood to the fire. She checked the thermometer on the south wall, 31 degrees outside, 64 degrees inside. The double wall was doing its work. 10 days later, on the 12th of January, Doss Hewitt walked up the creek road to Hadley's gate. Doss Hewitt was 74 years old. He had been in the Bitterroot Valley since 1863, longer than any other living person except a Salish woman on the reservation, who was said to be 90, but who might have been older and who did not concern herself with the calendars of white settlers. Doss had built 3 houses in the valley with his own hands. He had built a barn and a root cellar and a spring house and a stone wall along the creek to prevent flooding on his lower pasture. He had been a mason and a carpenter and a blacksmith and a farmer, and now he was 74, and he was none of those things except a man who watched the weather and the animals in the sky with the attention of a person who has survived 24 Montana winters and who has learned that the mountains do not care whether you survive the 25th. He stood at Hadley's gate. He did not knock. He did not call out. He stood with his hands in the pockets of his coat, a coat that was 20 years old and patched at the elbows with leather, and that still fit him the way it had fit him when he was 54, because Doss Hewitt had not gained or lost a pound in 20 years. He stood and he waited. Hadley saw him from the window. She came to the gate. She opened it. She said, "Mr. Hewitt, come in." He came in. He walked through the gate and he stood in the space between the two walls, and he looked at the inner wall and he looked at the outer wall and he looked at the 3-foot gap between them, packed with dry grass and earth. He put his hand on the inner wall. He felt the stone. He nodded once the way a man nods when he sees a piece of work that has been done the way he would have done it. He walked through the inner gate and into the yard between the inner wall and the cabin. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the double windows. He looked at the wood pile, 3 cords stacked tight against the inner wall. He looked at the smokehouse with its doors sealed and its chimney cold. He did not enter the cabin. He stood in the yard and he looked at the sky. The sky was clear. The temperature was 28 degrees warm for mid-January, and the Bitterroot warm enough that the snow on the meadow had softened at the surface and refrozen in a crust that crackled underfoot. The sun was low and pale, the winter sun that gives light without warmth, and it sat on the ridge to the south like a coin laid on the edge of a table. Doss looked at the sky for a long time. He looked at the way the clouds sat on the Bitterroot Range to the west, flat clouds smooth on the bottom, the kind of clouds that form when warm air rides over cold air at an altitude. He looked at the snow on the peaks, which was blue in the shadow of the clouds, a blue that was deeper than it should have been in January, a blue that meant the snow was dense and wet and had been laid down by storms that came from the Pacific and carried moisture that the mountains squeezed out of the air and deposited on the peaks in layers that were heavier than the dry powder snow of a normal winter. He looked at the creek. The creek was still running, which was unusual for mid-January, because Birch Creek usually froze solid by the first week of the month and stayed frozen until March. The water was dark and slow, and the ice along the banks was thin, and this too was a sign, though, of what Doss did not say. He turned to Hadley. He said one sentence. He said, "This winter is going to kill the cattle." He did not explain. He did not elaborate. He did not say how he knew or what he had seen in the sky or the snow or the creek that told him what was coming. He said the sentence and he let it stand the way a man who has survived 24 Montana winters lets his sentences stand without qualification and without apology. Hadley looked at him. She said, "I know." Doss nodded. He walked to the gate. He let himself out. He walked back down the creek road to his place, and Hadley watched him go, and she closed the gate, and she went inside, and she sat at the table, and she thought about what he had said and what she had said and what neither of them had needed to say, which was that the cattle were not the only things this winter was going to try to kill. The blizzard came on the 28th of January. It did not come the way a normal storm comes building over hours, the sky darkening slowly, the wind rising in stages, the snow beginning as flurries and thickening into curtains. This storm came the way a wall falls. One moment the sky was clear and the temperature was 40 degrees warm enough that the snow on the meadow was melting and the creek was running fast and brown with snow melt. The men of the valley were outside. Ephraim Jessup was in his pasture checking fence. Orrin Suttree was splitting firewood in his yard. Calvin Fentress was riding the creek road to Corvallis for supplies. The air was mild, and the sun was pale, and the day felt like early March instead of late January, and men who had been indoors for weeks stepped outside and breathed the warm air and thought the worst of the winter was behind them. They were wrong. At 2 in the afternoon, the wind shifted. It shifted from southwest to northwest in the space of 10 minutes, and the temperature dropped with it. It dropped 10 degrees in the first hour. It dropped another 10 in the second hour. By 4 in the afternoon, the thermometer on Hadley's south wall read 12 degrees above zero and dropping fast, and the sky to the northwest had turned a color that Hadley had never seen before, a dark blue-green that was not the color of a cloud, but the color of something behind the clouds, something vast and cold and moving toward the valley at a speed that the eye could measure by watching the shadows on the Bitterroot peaks change from minute to minute. By 5 in the afternoon, the temperature was 6 below zero. The wind was blowing 40 miles an hour from the northwest. The snow began. It did not begin as flurries. It began as a wall of white that came over the ridge and descended into the valley like a curtain being drawn across a stage. And when the curtain reached the floor of the valley, it did not stop. It thickened. It accelerated. Within 20 minutes, the visibility from Hadley's south window dropped from 2 miles to 200 yards to 20 yards to nothing. She could not see the outer wall from the cabin door. She could not see the gate. She could not see the meadow or the creek or the ridge where Boone was buried. She could see nothing but white driving horizontal, propelled by a wind that did not gust, but blew with a constant, sustained force that pressed against the outer wall of her fortress like a hand pressing against a door. She closed the double doors. She stoked the fire. She added 2 logs of ponderosa, and she opened the damper wide, and the fire roared up with a heat that pushed back the chill that had begun to seep through the double windows despite the dead air space between the panes. The thermometer inside the cabin read 58 degrees. She added another log. The thermometer climbed to 60, then 62, then 64. She closed the damper to half, and the fire settled into the steady burn that Boone's 11-degree fireback was designed to produce, a burn that threw heat forward into the room at a rate that matched the heat loss through the walls and the windows and the doors, holding the interior temperature at 62 degrees while the exterior temperature continued to fall. At 8 in the evening, the thermometer on the south wall read 31 degrees below zero. 31 below zero with a sustained wind of 50 miles per hour. The wind chill, a concept that no one in the Bitterroot Valley had a name for in 1887, but that every person in the valley understood in the marrow of their bones, was somewhere below 70 degrees below zero. Exposed skin would freeze in 2 minutes. Exposed flesh would die in 10. A man caught in the open between his barn and his house would lose his way in the whiteout and be found in the morning, if he was found at all, 20 yards from his own door, frozen in the position he had fallen, in his hands still reaching for the wall he could not see. Hadley sat by the fire. She sat in the chair Boone had built from ponderosa and elk, hide the chair she had sat in every evening for 6 years, and she listened to the storm. The storm made sounds she had never heard before. The wind did not howl. It screamed. It screamed with a sustained high note that did not rise and did not fall, but held its pitch the way a locomotive whistle holds its pitch as the train passes, and the sound came through the double walls and the packed insulation and the log walls of the cabin as a vibration more than a sound, a tremor she could feel in the floor and in the chair and in the bones of her face. At 9:17 in the evening, she heard the tree. She knew the sound. She had heard it once before in her life, on the night of the 14th of January, 1884, and she would never forget it because it was the last sound she had heard before the world broke, and it was a sound that lived in the deepest part of her memory, the way certain sounds live in the memories of soldiers who have survived a battle. The crack of roots letting go, the groan of a trunk beginning to tip, the accelerating whistle of a 70-foot tree falling through the air, and then the impact. The impact shook the cabin. It shook the jars on the shelves. It shook the fire in the firebox and sent a shower of sparks up the chimney. It shook the floor and the walls and the ceiling, and it shook Hadley in her chair so hard that her teeth came together and her hands gripped the armrests and her eyes closed and her body went rigid with a fear so old and so deep that it did not come from her mind, but from her blood, from the place where the body stores the memory of the worst thing that has ever happened to it. She sat rigid for perhaps 10 seconds. Then she opened her eyes. She looked at the west wall of the cabin. The wall was intact. The logs were unbroken. No tree trunk protruded through the chinking. No wind came through. No snow. No cold. The wall held. The cabin held. The fire burned. The jars sat on their shelves, two of them tipped sideways by the impact, but none of them broken. The thermometer read 60 degrees down 2 degrees from the shock of the impact, but holding. She stood up. She walked to the west wall. She put her hand on the logs. The logs were solid. She could feel a faint vibration in the wood. The residual tremor of the impact transmitted through the stone walls and the packed insulation into the cabin itself. But the tremor was fading and the wood was whole and nothing had come through. She understood what had happened. A tree had fallen. A ponderosa, probably the same size as the one that had killed Boone, probably driven by the same kind of wind, probably striking the same west wall, probably at the same height, probably with the same force. And the outer wall had caught it. 6 feet of creek granite, 3 feet thick at the base, had absorbed the impact and held the trunk and prevented it from reaching the inner wall, and prevented the inner wall from transmitting the force to the cabin, and prevented the cabin from being breached, and prevented the logs from being broken, and prevented the wind from entering, and prevented the cold from entering, and prevented the tree from doing what it had done on the 14th of January, 1884, which was to come through a wall and kill the man who was sleeping behind it. She stood with her hand on the west wall of the cabin for a long time. She stood there with her palm flat against the ponderosa logs that Boone had cut and peeled and notched and raised, and she felt the warmth of the wood, and she felt the solidity of it, and behind the wood she felt the stone, and behind the stone she felt the 3 feet of packed fiber, and behind the fiber she felt the outer wall, and against the outer wall she felt the weight of the tree that had fallen and been stopped. She cried. She had not cried since the morning she buried Boone on the ridge above the creek. She had not cried when Drusilla Jessup laughed at her wall. She had not cried when Colton Breyer brought a lawyer to her gate. She had not cried through the 20 months of solitude and labor and silence that had followed the worst night of her life. She cried now. She cried standing in her cabin with her hand on the wall, with the fire burning and the storm screaming outside, and the tree lying against the outer wall and the inner wall standing whole, and the cabin standing whole, and her body standing whole inside it. She cried because the wall had held. She cried because the promise she had made to the pine cross on the ridge had been kept. She cried because Boone was not here to see it. She cried because she was alive and he was not. And the difference between the two outcomes was a wall of stone that she had built with her own hands from creek granite mortared with mud and pitch, a wall that no one in the Bitterroot Valley had understood, and that half the valley had laughed at, and that had just done the one thing it had been built to do. She wept for perhaps 5 minutes. She wept with her hand on the wall and her forehead pressed against the wood, and her eyes closed and her shoulders shaking. Then she stopped. She wiped her face on her sleeve. She went back to the fire. She added a log. She sat down in the chair. She pulled the quilt around her shoulders. She listened to the storm. The storm did not stop. It blew through the night and into the morning and through the morning and into the afternoon. 36 hours of sustained wind at 40 to 60 miles an hour, with temperatures between 20 and 40 degrees below zero, with snow falling at a rate of 2 inches per hour. By the morning of the 29th, the snow was 4 feet deep on the level ground of the meadow and drifted to 8 and 10 feet against the windward faces of every structure in the valley. The outer wall of Hadley's double wall was buried to the capstones on the north and west sides. The tree that had fallen against the west wall was invisible, entombed in a drift that rose from the base of the wall to a height of 9 feet and extended 20 feet into the meadow. Inside the cabin, the thermometer read 61 degrees. The fire burned, the jars sat on their shelves, the elk meat hung in the smokehouse. The double windows held the cold at bay. The double doors kept the wind from entering. The double wall kept the world from breaking through. Hadley Corwin sat in her chair by the fire on the morning of the 29th of January, 1887, and she ate a breakfast of smoked elk and canned tomatoes and coffee, and she ate it slowly, and she ate it alone, and she ate it in a cabin that was 61 degrees in a valley that was 34 below zero. And she understood with a clarity that went beyond words that she had built what she had set out to build, and that what she had set out to build had been tested and that the test had been passed. She did not know yet what was happening in the rest of the valley. She did not know that the roof of the Jessup house had collapsed under the weight of 4 feet of wet snow at 3 in the morning. She did not know that the Suttree family had run out of firewood at midnight and had begun burning furniture. She did not know that Calvin Fentress had been caught between his barn and his house at the start of the storm and had spent 3 hours in the barn with his horses before he could find the rope he had strung between the two buildings and follow it back to his front door. She did not know that Colton Breyer, who had been staying at the boarding house in Corvallis, had watched the roof of the boarding house peel away in a gust at 4 in the morning and had spent the rest of the night in the root cellar beneath the kitchen floor with the proprietor and two other boarders wrapped in horse blankets, burning candles for warmth. She did not know any of this. She knew only that her cabin was warm and her walls were standing and her food was on the shelves, and the tree that had tried to kill her, the way a tree had killed her husband, was lying in the snow against the outer wall, stopped held, defeated by 6 feet of creek granite that a 38-year-old widow had stacked with her own hands because she had made a promise to a dead man and she had kept it. She finished her breakfast. She washed her plate. She added wood to the fire. She checked the thermometer. She sat down and she waited for whatever was coming next, because she had learned in 2 years and 9 months of widowhood that whatever is coming next comes whether you wait for it or not, and that waiting for it in a warm room behind a double wall is better than waiting for it in a cold room behind a single wall, and that the difference between the two is not luck or money or the help of neighbors, but the willingness to build when other people are laughing. The knocking came on the morning of the 30th of January, 36 hours after the storm had begun, and 12 hours after the tree had fallen against the west wall and been stopped. Hadley was at the fire. She was adding a log. The storm was still blowing, though the wind had dropped from 50 miles an hour to perhaps 35, and the temperature had risen from 34 below zero to 22 below, which was not a warming so much as a lessening of the cold. The way a man who has been beaten stops being beaten, not because the beating is over, but because the arm doing the beating has tired. The snow was still falling. The world outside the double wall was still white and formless and roaring. The knocking was faint. She almost did not hear it over the sound of the wind and the fire. It came from the direction of the south gate, and it was not the knocking of a hand on wood, but the knocking of a fist on stone, which makes a different sound, a flat, dead sound that does not carry the way a knock on a wooden door carries. And Hadley heard it only because she had spent 2 years and 9 months listening to the sounds her walls made, and she knew which sounds belonged to the wind and which sounds belonged to something else. She went to the south gate. She opened the inner gate. She walked through the 3-foot passage between the two walls. She opened the outer gate. Ephraim Jessup stood in the snow. He was hatless. His face was white. His mustache was crusted with ice. Behind him stood his wife Nettie, holding a child in each arm, a boy of 5 and a girl of 3. The children were wrapped in a single horse blanket. Nettie was wearing a nightgown under a man's coat. Her feet were in boots that were unlaced and stuffed with rags. Behind Nettie, barely visible in the driving snow, stood a figure Hadley did not recognize until it moved, and the movement revealed the thin frame and the hunched shoulders of Ephraim's hired man, a Swede named Lundgren, who slept in the bunkhouse behind the Jessup barn and who was carrying on his back a canvas sack that contained, as Hadley would learn later, everything the Jessup family had been able to salvage from their house before the second floor collapsed. Ephraim did not speak. He stood in the snow at Hadley's gate with his hands at his sides, and his mouth opened once and closed again, and no words came out. The mouth of a man who has spent 2 months laughing at a woman's wall does not easily form the words that ask to be let inside that wall. The mouth tries, the jaw works, the lips move. But the sound that should come out is blocked by something in the throat that is not physical, but is as real as bone, and the something is the memory of his own laughter and the knowledge that the woman standing in the gate heard it. Hadley looked at him. She looked at Nettie. She looked at the children in Nettie's arms. She looked at the boy. The boy's face was gray. His lips were the color of a winter scuite. His eyes were open, but they were not seeing Hadley. They were seeing something far away or nothing at all, which is the same thing when a child has been cold for too long. She stepped aside. She held the gate open with her body. She said, "Come in." That was all she said. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not say, "Where is your wall?" She did not say, "You laughed at me." She said, "Come in," and the 2 words were enough. And Ephraim Jessup walked through the gate of the outer wall, and through the passage between the 2 walls, and through the gate of the inner wall, and into the yard of Hadley Corwin's cabin, and his wife followed, and Lundgren followed, and the snow blew in behind them. And Hadley closed the outer gate and closed the inner gate, and the wind hit the stone and stopped. She took the boy from Nettie's arms. The boy was limp. His skin was cold in the way that skin is cold when the cold has gone past the surface and into the blood. She carried him inside the cabin, and she laid him on the floor beside the fireplace, and she pulled the quilt from her bed, and she wrapped him in it, and she held him against her chest the way she had seen her mother hold a calf that had been born in a snowstorm, pressing the warmth of her own body into the small, cold body through the fabric. And she rocked him without thinking about the rocking, because the rocking was in her, the way breathing was in her, a motion the body makes when another body needs it. She put Nettie in the chair by the fire. She put the girl in Nettie's lap. She gave Lundgren a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. She stoked the fire until the thermometer read 66 degrees, 4 degrees higher than she normally kept it, because the room now held 7 people instead of 1, and the 2 children and the woman in the nightgown needed the extra heat more than the firewood needed to be conserved. Ephraim stood just inside the door. He stood the way a man stands in a room he has been laughing about for 3 months, with his shoulders drawn in and his hands at his sides and his eyes moving across the shelves and the grease and the smoked meat and the double windows and the sealed walls and the fire-throwing heat from the 11-degree fire back into a room that was 66 degrees while the world outside was 22 below zero. He took in every detail. He did not speak. Hadley warmed milk in the cast-iron pot. She added a spoonful of honey from the grain on the shelf, honey she had traded for in September from a beekeeper near Corvallis. She cooled the milk to the temperature she could hold on the inside of her wrist without flinching, which was the temperature her mother had taught her to test when feeding a sick calf. And she lifted the boy's head into the crook of her arm, and she put the edge of the cup against his lips, and she said, "Drink this. You do not have to open your eyes. You only have to swallow." The boy swallowed. It took 3 minutes to get the first half cup into him. She waited. She held him. She felt his heart beat against her forearm, slow and irregular, the heartbeat of a body that has spent too many hours in the cold and is remembering how to be warm. She gave him a second half cup. She gave the girl a cup of the same milk with honey. She gave Nettie a cup of coffee. She gave Ephraim a cup of coffee, and when she handed it to him, their eyes met, and she saw in his face something she had not expected to see, which was not shame and not gratitude, but recognition. The recognition of a man who is standing in the proof of his own error and who is seeing for the first time what the error cost and what the correction looks like. The second family came 4 hours later. Orrin Suttree arrived at the South Gate at 2 in the afternoon with his wife Emmeline and their 3 children, ages 11 and 8 and 4. They had been burning furniture since midnight. The chairs first, then the kitchen table, then the bed frame from the children's room. When the furniture was gone, they had begun on the shelving, and when the shelving was gone, Orrin had looked at his wife, and his wife had looked at him, and they had put the children in every piece of clothing they owned, and they had walked 1.5 miles through the storm to the only place in the valley that Orrin knew was still standing, because he had seen the double wall from the road in December, and he had laughed about it at Grogan's store, and he was not laughing now. Hadley opened the gate. She let them in. She gave them blankets and coffee and canned tomatoes heated in the pot. 12 people in a cabin 16 feet by 20 feet, 320 square feet, 26 square feet per person. Tight but possible, the way things are possible when the alternative is not possible at all. Calvin Fentress came at dusk. He came alone because his wife and children had gone to her mother's place in Corvallis before the storm and had not been able to return. Calvin had spent the storm in his barn with his horses after being caught outside when the wind shifted. He had survived 2 nights in the barn by burying himself in hay between 2 horses and letting the horses' body heat keep him alive. On the morning of the 30th, he had dug out of the barn and walked 3 miles through chest-deep snow to Hadley's gate. His feet were frostbitten. 2 toes on his left foot were white and hard. Hadley sat him by the fire, and she put his feet in a basin of warm water. Not hot warm, because hot water on frostbitten flesh causes the kind of pain that makes a grown man scream. And she raised the temperature of the water by degrees over the course of an hour until the color came back to his toes, and Calvin Fentress put his face in his hands and wept with the pain and the relief and the particular gratitude of a man who has spent 2 nights in a barn believing he was going to die, and who is now sitting in a warm room with his feet in a basin while a woman he barely knows tends to him as if he were her own family. 13 people. Hadley fed them from the shelves. She opened jars of green beans and tomatoes and corn. She cut smoked elk from the rack in the smokehouse, making the trip between the cabin and the smokehouse through the protected space inside the inner wall, where the snow had drifted only 2 feet because the wall blocked the wind. She heated stew in the cast iron pot, and she served it in tin cups because she did not have enough bowls. And the 13 people sat and stood and leaned against every available surface in the 16 by 20 room, and they ate and they drank and they did not speak much, because the sound of the wind outside and the sound of the fire inside filled the silence with a kind of language that did not require words. At 8 in the evening of the 30th, one more knock came at the gate. Hadley went to the gate. She opened it. Colton Breyer stood in the snow. His right hand was wrapped in a strip of cloth that was dark with blood. His coat was torn at the shoulder. His hat was gone. His face had the particular expression of a man who has arrived at the last place on earth he expected to ask for help and who understands that the asking will cost him something he cannot name but can feel. He said, "Mrs. Corwin, I am sorry to trouble you. The boarding house roof came off. My hand is cut. I have nowhere to go." Hadley looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She thought about the lawyer Pardee and the leather portfolio and the fabricated boundary dispute. She thought about the words, "Montana winters change people's minds." She thought about all of it for perhaps 3 seconds. She stepped aside. She held the gate. "Come in," she said. 14 people. She sat Colton on the floor near the east wall. She unwrapped his hand. The cut ran across his palm from the base of the thumb to the heel, a deep cut that had bled freely and was still bleeding slowly. She cleaned the wound with water warmed on the stove. She packed it with a poultice of moss and pine pitch, the same mixture she used to seal the joints in her wall because the pitch was antimicrobial, though she did not know that word, and the moss was absorbent, and the combination had kept every cut she had sustained in 2 years of building from festering. She wrapped the hand in clean cloth torn from a flour sack. She tied the cloth tight. She gave him a cup of coffee. She did not mention the land dispute. She did not mention the lawyer. She did not mention the survey plat or the fabricated irregularity or the words they had exchanged at the gate. She handed him a cup of coffee and a bowl of elk stew, and she turned away and she went back to the fire because feeding a man who tried to take your land is not forgiveness. It is simply what a person does when another person is bleeding in her house. The bleeding comes first. The reckoning comes later, or it does not come at all, and either way, the bleeding comes first. The storm blew through the night of the 30th and into the morning of the 31st, and it did not stop until the afternoon of the 1st of February. 4 days. 4 days of wind and snow and cold that would be recorded in the journals of the territory as the worst sustained blizzard in the history of white settlement in the Bitterroot Valley, and that would be remembered by the Salish people on the reservation as the winter of the blue snow, the winter that killed the cattle. On the night of the 31st, the third night, the Jessup boy stopped being all right. He had been improving through the second day. He had eaten. He had drunk warm milk. He had sat up. He had spoken to his sister. Hadley had thought the worst was past. But at 9 in the evening, the boy began to shiver, and the shivering was not the ordinary shivering of a cold child warming up. It was the deep shivering that comes from inside the shivering that starts in the core of the body when the core temperature has been lowered too far for too long, and the body, even in a warm room, cannot bring itself back to normal. His skin went hot and dry. His eyes went glassy. He said he was cold. He said it 3 times, and each time he said it, his voice was smaller than the time before. Nettie grabbed for him. Ephraim stood up from the floor where he had been sitting. The room went quiet. 14 people in a 16 by 20 cabin, and every one of them stopped moving at the same time because the sound of a child saying, "I am cold," in a room that is 64 degrees is a sound that stops every other sound. Hadley knelt beside the boy. She put her hand on his forehead. The forehead was hot. She put her hand on his chest. The chest was shaking with the shivering. She pulled the quilt tighter around him. She warmed milk. She added honey. She held the cup to his lips. He drank, but he drank the way a child drinks, when drinking is effort, slowly with pauses, with the particular concentration of a body that is using all of its remaining energy to do one thing at a time. She held him through the night. She held him in her arms on the floor beside the fireplace, with the quilt around both of them, and her body pressed against his, transferring her warmth into him, the way a stove transfers heat into a room steadily, constantly, without interruption. She did not sleep. She did not shift. She did not lay him down. She held him the way she had not held her own child because she had not had a child. And the holding was in her body, the way the rocking had been in her body, a thing she knew how to do without having learned it, a thing the body carries from the beginning and waits its whole life to use. At 3 in the morning, the shivering stopped. Hadley's heart contracted. She put her ear against his chest. She listened. The heartbeat was there. It was steady. It was stronger than it had been at 9. The shivering had stopped not because the body had given up, but because the body had won. The warmth had reached the core. The core temperature had risen. The shivering was no longer needed. The boy opened his eyes at dawn. He looked up at Hadley. He looked at the corbelled stone of the fireplace above him. He looked at the fire. He said, "I am hungry." Nettie Jessup made a sound that was not a word. It was the sound a mother makes when the child she thought she might lose says a thing that only a living child says. A sound that comes from a place below the throat and above the heart, a place that has no name in anatomy, but that every mother knows. Nettie put her hands over her face and she bent forward, and the sound came out of her once, and then she was quiet. Hadley gave the boy warm milk and a piece of smoked elk cut thin. He ate it. He ate it slowly the way a person eats when eating is a thing the body has remembered how to do. She laid him on the sleeping platform, and she covered him with the quilt, and she stood up, and her back ached, and her arms ached, and her legs were numb from sitting on the floor for 8 hours, and she walked to the stove and she put the coffee on. Ephraim Jessup was standing by the south window. He had been standing there through the night, watching Hadley hold his grandson, the way a man watches a thing he cannot do himself being done by someone he did not believe could do it. He had not spoken. He had not interfered. He had stood by the window and he had watched, and on his face was the expression of a man who is seeing clearly for the first time in a long while and who does not like what the clarity shows him about himself. On the morning of the 1st of February, with the storm finally beginning to weaken, the wind dropping to 20 miles an hour and the snow thinning enough that Hadley could see the outer wall from the cabin door, for the first time in 4 days, Ephraim Jessup sat down on the floor beside the fireplace. He sat with his back against the stone and his legs stretched out in front of him, and he looked at the fire and he said, "Mrs. Corwin." Hadley was at the stove. She turned. He said, "I want to ask you a thing. Why did you build 2 walls?" The room was quiet, 14 people, and none of them moved. The question had been in the room for 4 days in the air, the way smoke is in the air present, but unspoken, and now it had been spoken, and the room held its breath. Hadley did not answer immediately. She stood at the stove with the coffee pot in her hand, and she looked at the fire, and she looked at the west wall of the cabin, the wall the tree had come through 3 years ago, the wall she had repaired with logs she had cut and peeled and notched herself, the wall that was whole now and that had a second wall of stone behind it and a third wall of stone behind that. She looked at the wall for a long time. She said the 14th of January, 1884. 2 in the morning. The wind took a ponderosa pine. The tree came through the west wall. It came through the wall and into the room. It came through at the height of the bed. My husband put his body over mine. The tree hit him. He died before I could speak his name 3 times. She stopped. She did not look at Ephraim. She looked at the wall. She said if there had been a wall outside that wall, the tree would not have come through. The wall would have caught it. The wall would have held it. And he would be alive. And he would be sitting in that chair by the fire. And I would not be standing here explaining to you why I built what I built. She stopped again. She set the coffee pot on the stove. She turned to face the room. 14 people looked at her. None of them spoke. The fire crackled. The wind pressed against the outer wall, and the outer wall held. She said, I did not build the walls because of the wildlife. I did not build the walls because of the cold. I built the walls because I lost my husband through a wall that was not thick enough, and I made a promise at his grave that nothing would come through my walls again. Not a tree, not a storm, not the cold, not anything. Ephraim Jessup lowered his head. He looked at his hands. His hands were folded in his lap, and they were the hands of a man who had been prosperous in certain for 30 years, and who was sitting on the floor of a widow's cabin in borrowed blankets because his own house had collapsed and his own grandson had nearly died. And the only thing between his family and the storm was the double wall that he had called a fortress and a folly and a waste of time. He did not raise his head. He did not speak. There was nothing to say that would not have been smaller than what she had said. The room understood this. 14 people in a 16 by 20 cabin understood that the silence after Hadley's words was not the silence of a room with nothing to say, but the silence of a room that has heard the truth and is letting the truth settle into the floor the way water settles into stone. In the morning of the 2nd of February, the sky cleared. The wind stopped. The sun came out over the Bitterroot Range for the first time in 5 days, and the light on the snow was so bright that the people who stepped outside squinted and raised their hands to shield their eyes because the eyes had grown accustomed to the dimness of the cabin and the grayness of the storm, and the eyes were not ready for the world to be this bright. Hadley opened the south gate. She stepped outside the outer wall. She looked at the valley. The valley was white and still and silent, in the way that a valley is silent after a storm that has killed most of what lived in it. The trees along Birch Creek were bent and broken. The meadow was a flat white plain without a fence post showing because the snow was 5 feet deep on the level and the fences were buried. The ridge where Boone was buried was a smooth white dome with no cross visible because the snow had covered the cross, and Hadley looked at the ridge and she knew the cross was there beneath the snow, the way she knew Boone was there beneath the earth, present, unseen, holding. The cattle were dead. She could not see them yet, but she would see them when the snow melted. 90% of the cattle in the Bitterroot Valley died in the winter of the blue snow. Ephraim Jessup lost 108 of his 120 head. Orrin Suttree lost all 30 of his. Calvin Fentress lost all 40 of his. The cattle had been caught in the open when the storm came, and the snow had buried them, and the cold had killed what the snow did not bury, and the wind had driven the survivors into draws and coulees, where they piled up against fences and froze standing. In the spring when the snow melted, the ranchers of the Bitterroot would find their cattle in windrows along the fence lines, frozen in rows like soldiers fallen in formation, and the stench would carry for miles and the financial ruin would carry for years. Colton Breyer came to Hadley on the morning of the 2nd of February, after the others had gone outside to look at the valley and to begin in the stunned and mechanical way that people begin after a disaster to assess what was left. He found her alone at the south gate. He stood beside her. He did not look at her. He looked at the valley. He said, Mrs. Corwin, I have a thing to tell you. She waited. He said, the survey of your land is clean. The boundary is correct. The filing is valid. There was never an irregularity. The dispute was manufactured. Mr. Pardee was paid to present a challenge that had no basis. The intention was to create enough legal uncertainty to persuade you to sell rather than fight. I was paid a commission by the investors in Helena. The commission was $200. He stopped. He looked at his bandaged hand, the hand she had cleaned and packed and wrapped without asking why he had come, or what he had done, or what he intended to do next. He said, I have been a man of poor character for most of my adult life. I have done things for money that I am not proud of and that I will not list because listing them would not change them. but I have not until this week slept 3 nights in the house of a woman I tried to cheat, while she fed me from her own stores and bandaged my hand with her own cloth and did not say one word about what I had done to her. He reached into his coat with his good hand. He drew out a folded paper. He held it out to her. He said, "This is the letter of engagement between myself and the Helena investors regarding your property. It is the only copy. You may do with it what you wish." Hadley took the paper. She did not unfold it. She did not read it. She put it in the pocket of her apron. She said, "Where will you go, Mr. Breyer?" He said, "East, away from here." She nodded. She did not thank him. She did not forgive him. She did not tell him that what he had done was understandable or forgivable or anything other than what it was. She nodded once the way a woman nods when a transaction has been completed and the terms are clear and the business is finished. Colton Breyer walked down the creek road that morning. He walked through 5 feet of snow in a torn coat with a bandaged hand, and he walked until he reached Corvallis, and he caught the stage to Missoula, and from Missoula he went east, and he did not return to the Bitterroot Valley. He was not heard from again. The thaw began in the second week of February. It was not a true spring thaw. It was the brief warming that comes between storms in a Montana winter, a few days of sun and mild air that melts the top layer of snow and reveals what the storm has buried. The valley smelled of death. The cattle lay in the meadows and along the fence lines in the attitudes they had died in, and the ranchers walked among them, counting losses, the way a man counts coins after a robbery slowly, with the particular numbness that comes from watching a number climb higher than the mind is willing to follow. Ephraim Jessup lost everything. 108 head of cattle at $35 per head was $3,780, which was more money than Ephraim had in the bank and more money than the land was worth without the cattle on it. He stood in his south pasture on the 14th of February, and he looked at the carcasses of his herd, and he did not speak for a long time. And when he did speak, what he said was not about the cattle. He said, "I am going up to the Corwin place." He walked up the creek road. He came to Hadley's gate. He knocked. Hadley opened the gate. He said, "Mrs. Corwin, I have come to repair your wall." She looked at him. She looked past him down the creek road. She looked at the outer wall, which had been damaged on the west side where the ponderosa had fallen against it, the top 2 courses of stone displaced by the impact. The mortar cracked in a line that ran 4 feet along the capstones. She said, "You have your own house to rebuild, Mr. Jessup." He said, "Your wall saved my grandson. My house can wait." She opened the gate. He came in. He took off his coat. He picked up the first stone that had been displaced from the top course, and he set it back in place, and he packed the joint with mud and pitch the way he had seen Hadley do it, because he had been watching her wall for 3 months, and he had watched it the way a man watches a thing he does not understand closely, with the attention of a person who is looking for the flaw that will prove his judgment right. And he had not found the flaw, and he was not going to find the flaw. And what he had found instead was a way of building that worked, and he was going to learn it now from the wall itself, because the woman who built it did not need to teach him. The wall was the teacher. He worked for 3 days. On the second day, Orrin Suttree came with his oldest son, and they worked alongside Ephraim, resetting stones and packing mortar. On the third day, Calvin Fentress came on his frostbitten feet, walking with a limp that would stay with him for the rest of his life, and he brought a sledge loaded with creek granite from the gravel bar below his place, because the wall needed new stone for the sections that had been cracked beyond repair, and Calvin Fentress had decided that hauling stone for a widow was a better use of his time than standing in his pasture counting dead cattle. Hadley did not direct the work. She did not need to. The men looked at the wall and they understood how it was built, and they built it the way it had been built, because the wall taught them the way a good piece of carpentry teaches anyone who looks at it carefully. She fed them. She gave them coffee and elk stew and canned tomatoes, and she did not discuss the storm or the cattle or the things that had been said at Grogan's store because the work was the discussion. The stones being set in place were the words. The mortar being packed was the apology. The wall being rebuilt was the answer to every joke and every sneer and every knowing glance that had been exchanged in the settlement since October, and no one needed to say any of it aloud because the stone said it. Nettie Jessup came on the fourth day. She brought food. She brought a ham and a sack of flour and a jar of honey, and she brought them to Hadley's door, and she stood in the doorway with the provisions in her arms, and she said, "I called your home a castle for one. I was wrong. It was a castle for 14. Hadley took the provisions. She said it was never a castle, Mrs. Jessup. It was a wall. Walls do what walls do, which is hold. Spring came slowly. It came in the grudging way that spring comes to the Bitterroot after a hard winter. A degree at a time, a bare patch of ground appearing on a south-facing slope, and then disappearing under a late snow, and then appearing again larger as the sun climbed higher and the days lengthened, and the creek rose with snow melt, and the air began to carry the smell of mud and new grass instead of ice and old death. The community that emerged from the winter of the blue snow was not the same community that had entered it. The cattle were gone. The money was gone. The easy certainty of men who had been prosperous for a decade was gone. What remained was a settlement of 9 families who had learned in 4 days what the woman on Birch Creek had learned in one night 3 years earlier, which was that the world can come through your wall if your wall is not strong enough, and that the things you build before the storm are the things that save you during the storm, and that the only preparation that matters is the preparation you do when everyone around you is laughing. In March, Hadley opened her south gate, and she invited the families of the valley onto her land. She marked out a garden plot on the south side of her cabin between the outer wall and the meadow 60 feet long and 20 feet wide, larger than any garden she had planted alone, and she said the garden would be shared. Each family would plant a section. Each family would tend its own rows. Each family would harvest its own crop. But the water from Birch Creek would irrigate all of it, and the south-facing slope would warm all of it, and the outer wall would protect all of it from the wind that still came down out of the northwest with the particular ill will of a Montana spring that has not yet decided to stop being winter. They planted in April. They planted corn and beans and squash and potatoes and turnips and carrots. The standard homestead garden planted in soil that was black and deep and watered by a creek that ran strong with snowmelt. Ephraim Jessup planted a row of beans. Orrin Suttree planted carrots. Calvin Fentress planted potatoes with his son, doing the bending because Calvin's frostbitten toes did not allow him to kneel. Nettie Jessup planted tomatoes. The children planted squash. Hadley planted corn the way she and Boone had planted corn every May since they arrived in rows spaced 3 feet apart, with the seeds dropped 2 inches deep and 12 inches apart, the way Boone had taught her, which was the way his father had taught him, which was the way corn had been planted in the valleys of the American frontier for 100 years. Doss Hewitt did not plant. Doss was 74 years old that spring, and the winter had taken something from him that the spring could not give back. He came to the garden on the first day of planting, and he stood at the edge of the plot, and he watched the families working in the soil, and he watched Hadley moving among them with her seed bag and her hoe, and he watched the way the people looked at her, which was not the way they had looked at her in October. In October, they had looked at her with amusement and pity. In April, they looked at her with the particular attention that people give to a person they have decided to learn from. He watched all of this, and he nodded once, the same nod he had given when he put his hand on her inner wall in January, and felt the stone, the nod of a man who has seen a piece of work done the way he would have done it. He walked back down the creek road to his place. He did not come back to the garden. In June, his wife sent word that he was not well. Hadley walked to the Hewitt place on a Thursday morning, and she sat beside his bed for an hour. He was thin and gray, and his hands lay on the quilt like two pieces of driftwood, but his eyes were clear. They talked about stone. They talked about mortar. They talked about the way a wall holds weight, and the way a wall holds heat, and the way a wall holds a family inside it when the winter comes to take the family away. They talk the way two people talk who have both built things with their hands and who understand that the building is the conversation and the things they built are the words. Before she left, Doss said one thing that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. He said, "I left those nails and that draw knife at your gate because a woman who builds a wall, the way you built that wall, deserves tools that are worth the building. You have been worth the building." He died on the 23rd of July, 1887. He died in his bed with his wife beside him, and the summer light coming through the window, and the will he left was simple and short. The house and the household goods to his wife, a small sum to each of his children, and to Hadley Corwin, who was not related to him by blood or by marriage, his complete set of carpentry and masonry tools accumulated over 50 years of work packed in a wooden chest he had built from walnut when he was 30, and that was as sound as the day he had made it. The tools arrived at Hadley's gate on a wagon driven by Doss's eldest son, a man of 50 who had come from Missoula for the funeral. The son set the chest inside the inner wall, and he said, "You would know what to do with them." Hadley opened the chest. She looked at the tools, the trowels and the levels and the chisels and the hammers and the squares and the plumb bobs, each one worn smooth by 50 years of handling, each one oiled and sharp and ready. She closed the chest. She set it inside the cabin beside the document case that held Boone's survey plat. She sat at the table and she put her hands on the ponderosa planks, and she sat for a long time. In the autumn of 1887, 3 women came to Hadley's gate. They were widows. One was from the valley, 2 were from the Missoula country sent by the circuit preacher who had heard the story of the double wall, and the 14 people and the boy who had been saved on the 3rd night of the storm. The women came with the particular expression of women who have lost the men who built their houses and who have been told by the settlement that a woman alone cannot build what needs to be built, and who have come to the one place in the territory where that statement has been proven wrong. Hadley taught them. She taught them what her father had taught her in the blacksmith shop in Ohio, and what Boone had taught her on the homestead in Montana, and what she had taught herself in 2 years of building alone. She taught them to lay stone and mix mortar and cut timber and notch logs and hang doors and glaze windows and seal joints and build a double wall with a dead air space between the inner face and the outer face. She taught them the principle of mass, which is that a wall stops a moving object, not by being harder than the object, but by being heavier. She taught them the principle of dead air, which is that still air trapped between 2 solid surfaces does not conduct heat or cold the way a single solid surface conducts it. She taught them the principle of the 11-degree fireback, which is that heat reflects off a surface at the same angle it strikes it, and that a fireback angled at 11 degrees from vertical reflects the radiant heat of a fire forward into the room instead of upward into the flue. She taught them these things, and she sent them home, and the 3 women went back to their own homesteads, and they built walls, double walls, the kind of walls that a man who has never lost a husband through a single wall would not think to build. the kind of walls that hold. Hadley Corwin did not remarry. She did not leave the Bitterroot Valley. She did not sell the land. She lived in the cabin Boone had built until the cabin needed to be rebuilt, and then she rebuilt it herself using Doss Hewitt's tools and the skills Boone had taught her and the skills she had taught herself. She rebuilt it inside the double wall which she maintained every autumn, resetting the stones that frost had loosened, repacking the mortar, replacing the insulation between the walls with fresh dry grass and earth. She became, in the years after the storm, the person the settlement called on when a wall needed to be built, or a roof needed to be set, or a chimney needed to be laid. She became the person the widows came to. She became the person the young wives asked about food preservation and double windows in the angle of a fireback in the principle of dead air. She became, without seeking it and without refusing it, the center of a community that had laughed at her and then been saved by her, and that now came to her door, not with pity or amusement, but with the particular respect that is given to a person who has built something that works and who is willing to teach others to build the same. On an evening in late September of 1887, 8 months after the storm, Hadley walked up the ridge above the creek to the pine cross she had set at the head of Boone's grave 3 years before. The cross was still standing. The mortise joint she had cut, the joint that held without nails, was still tight. The wood had grayed in the weather, but the joint had not loosened and the cross had not leaned. She stood at the grave in the September light with the valley below her turning gold with autumn, and the cabin below that, and the double wall below that, and the smoke from the chimney rising straight in the still air, and the garden beside the outer wall where the community had planted corn and beans and squash in the spring, and where the corn was now standing 7 feet tall, heavy with ears, the stalks bent slightly with the weight of what they had produced. She put her hand on the top of the cross. She did not speak. She had said what she needed to say at this grave 3 years ago. She had made a promise. The promise had been kept. The wall had held. The tree had been stopped. The 14 people had been sheltered. The boy had been saved. The cattle had died, but the people had lived, and the people had lived because a woman who weighed 130 pounds had spent 3 months stacking creek granite in 2 concentric rings around a cabin and had been laughed at for doing it and had done it anyway. She stood at the grave for a long time. She stood until the sun went down behind the Bitterroot Range and the valley filled with shadow, and the cabin below was a dark shape against the last light, solid and square, and sitting inside its double wall, the way a heart sits inside a chest. Then she walked back down the ridge. She walked through the gate. She closed the gate. She went inside. She sat down in the chair Boone had built. She pulled the quilt her mother had made around her shoulders. She listened to the evening, to the creek running below the meadow, and the elk bugling on the ridges, and the fire crackling in the firebox behind the 11-degree fireback. She listened to the wind beginning to rise in the ponderosas on the slope, and she listened to the wind hit the outer wall, and she listened to what the wind became when it met the stone, which was nothing, which was silence, which was the sound of a promise kept. A wall is not a thing you build to keep the world out. A wall is a promise you make to what is inside. A promise that you will not lose it. A promise that you will not let it be taken. A promise that the thing that happened once, the worst thing, the thing that broke the wall and broke the body behind the wall and left you alone in the cold with blood on your skin and snow in your hair and a name on your lips that no one answered, will not happen again. Not here, not behind this stone, not while the mortar holds and the courses stand and the woman who laid them is still breathing. That is what the wall is for. That is what Hadley Corwin built. and it held. Norval finished with the chain at his own pace. He checked each link along the recovered section the way he always checked it after a working run, not because he expected damage, but because the standard he kept was the standard, regardless of outcome. The chain had held. He had known it would hold. But checking was not about doubt. It was about what you owed to the next job, the you that had not happened yet, the one that would come around in some future season and require this chain to be exactly what it was today. He coiled it back onto the drawbar in even loops. He wiped the hook with the rag from his jacket pocket. He checked the drawbar mounting. Then he stood up straight and looked at Conrad Farley, who had been standing 8 feet away, through all of it, not speaking, waiting. Conrad said, "What do I owe you?" Norval said, "A donation to the Clayton County Historical Society. They helped me restore this engine. That is how I would like to settle it." Conrad looked at him. He said, "How much of a donation?" Norval said, "What do you think 3 days of delays cost you?" Conrad said, "Close to $60,000 by the time it all ripples through." Norval said, "Give them 10,000. That is more money than they have seen at one time in years. They can use it to preserve machines like this one. Machines people laugh at until they need them." Conrad reached into his jacket and found his checkbook. He did not ask for a table or a surface or any of the things people usually ask for when they are about to write a significant check. He wrote it against the side of the machine, against the iron of the drawbar housing, pressing down with the pen and writing the amount without hesitating and tearing it out and holding it toward Norval. Norval took it. He looked at it once. He folded it and put it in the breast pocket of his ruined jacket with the care of a man who trusts paper somewhat less than he trusts iron, but recognizes that paper has its uses. Conrad said, "I was wrong about you. Yesterday, in front of my crew, what I said and how I said it." Norval looked at him steadily. He said, "Yes, you were. Just that. Not gracious and not punishing. The simple acknowledgement of a man who accepts what is being offered for exactly what it is, which was accurate, and returns it in kind, which was also accurate, and sees no reason to soften either." Conrad stood in that for a moment. He was not a man who found this kind of conversation easy, and he was not pretending otherwise. He had built his company partly on the projection of certainty, the specific quality of confidence that keeps a crew moving in difficult conditions and keeps clients willing to sign contracts with a man who will be managing their money through unpredictable circumstances. That projection had served him well, but it had costs that he had not fully tallied, one of which was a difficulty in standing in the presence of his own wrongness without reaching for something to cover it. He did not reach for anything. He said, "How did you know?" Not just that the machine could do it. How did you know where to stand the machine? How did you know where to hook the chain? Norval looked at the swamp. He said, "I have been walking the fence line on the east side of my property for 40 years. I know what that ground is doing 6 inches down and 12 inches down by what it does at the surface. There is a clay layer running along the margin of that swamp on the north side. Your surveyors did not find it because they were looking for something different. I knew it was there because I have been pressing my boots into that ground every spring since before some of your engineers were born." He paused. He said, "And I know where to put a chain on a buried frame because August knew and Everett knew and they showed me." Conrad said, "Your grandfather and your father." Norval said, "That is right." Conrad was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Come by tomorrow if you are willing. I want to understand more of what you understood. Not because I think I can do what you do, because I think I have been wrong about something for a long time, and I want to understand how wrong before I go on being wrong about it." Norval nodded once. He said, "Come in the morning. I will be in the shed." Then he climbed back up to the platform. Right knee first, the step across the moment of balance. He stood at the controls and opened the throttle, and the case came alive again with its deep, patient voice and began the turn toward the county road. The crew stepped aside to watch it go. Some of them raised a hand. Some of them just stood and looked the way you look at something when you are not ready for it to leave your sight, but cannot find a reason to stop it. The sound of the machine carried across the construction site as it moved away, the exhaust beat counting its steady cadence, and Conrad stood at the edge of the swamp and watched it go and did not move until it had turned onto the county road and was out of sight. And all that remained was the sound fading now, getting quieter by degrees until it was gone. He stood there for a little while longer after the sound was gone, looking at the swamp, at the ruts where the excavator had been sitting, at the clear ground where it now sat on solid earth with mud drying on the undercarriage and the tracks. One of his foremen came up beside him and said, "I can have a crew start washing her down this afternoon. Full inspection by morning, every fitting and every line." Conrad said, "Do it right. I want every track link looked at before she goes back to work." The foreman nodded. He paused and then said, "Hell of a thing." Conrad said, "Yes." The foreman moved off. Conrad stayed where he was for another minute and then went to make the phone calls that needed making, and the job went back to being a job, and the swamp was quiet. He did not see Corbett Haskell leave. Now I want to tell you about two things that happened in the days after, because both of them are part of the story, and neither of them makes full sense without the other. The first is the conversation that happened on Conrad Farley's farm on Thursday morning. Norval was in the shed when Conrad pulled in, working the same circuit of post-run checks he had been working, when the chain was coiled and the fuel was assessed and the condition of the drive wheels was confirmed. Conrad found him there and came into the shed and stopped near the front of the machine and looked at it with the eyes of a man who has revised his understanding of something overnight and is still working out the implications. Norval kept working. He said, "Come in. There is coffee in the house if you want it. I will be with you in a minute." Conrad said, "I am fine here." He stood and watched Norval move around the machine. After a while, he said, "I have been in this business for 20 years. I built it on the belief that newer was better, that more capability meant better results, that the right answer to any problem was the right modern tool applied with enough expertise." Norval looked up at him. Conrad said, "That belief has served me well for 20 years. It has also apparently been exactly wrong on at least one occasion that I know of, and probably others I have not thought about yet." Norval set down the rag he was holding. He leaned against the drive wheel and looked at Conrad. He said, "Your equipment is better than this machine for most things. Faster, more precise, more capable in the conditions it was designed for. I am not one of those men who thinks old is automatically better than new. That is its own kind of foolishness." Conrad said, Norval said, "But some jobs require something specific that the modern design has designed away. Your bulldozers are built to protect themselves from overload. They have limits engineered into them that prevent them from destroying themselves when the conditions get worse than the specifications assumed. That is good engineering for most situations. In this situation, it was the thing that stopped them." Conrad said, "And yours has no such limits." Norval said, "My only limits are what I decide. The machine will do what I tell it to do until something breaks. The question is whether I know when to stop and when to keep going. That judgment is mine. There is no system that makes it for me." Conrad said, "And you knew when to keep going." Norval said, "I knew because August knew and Everett knew, and they showed me. They showed me over years of doing the work, not in a conversation or a manual, but in the field with the machine running and the load reel and the consequences actual. That kind of knowing does not live anywhere except in the person who accumulated it, and it does not transfer except by the same process. Conrad was quiet for a moment. He said, "How much have you been paid over the years for the jobs you did with this machine?" Norval said nothing. Conrad looked at him. Norval said, "I was not available for hire. When someone had a problem that I could see the machine would solve, I offered to help. Same arrangement every time. Donation to the Historical Society, whatever they could honestly afford." Conrad said, "Because of the $10,000 their building fund is going to be funded. They have been trying to build a proper space for preservation work for 6 years." Norval said, "I know. I have been on their board for 12 years. Conrad looked at the machine. He said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." Norval waited. Conrad said, "If I had come to you on Sunday after the machine went in, before I tried the bulldozers and the winch and the crane, would you have offered to help then?" Norval considered this. He said no. Conrad said, "Why?" Norval said, "Because on Sunday you were not in a condition to hear what I had to offer. A man who has not exhausted his certainty cannot receive an answer that does not fit the shape of his certainty. You would have laughed at me on Sunday the same way you laughed at me on Tuesday, but on Sunday you would have been right to laugh, because on Sunday you had not tried everything else. On Tuesday you had." Conrad absorbed this. He said, "You waited on purpose." Norval said, "I waited because it was the right time to offer, and Sunday was not the right time. I have learned through experience when the right time is. It is not comfortable watching 3 days of things that will not work happen when you can see what will work, but it is necessary." Conrad said, "That seems like a hard way to operate." Norval said, "It is what the situation requires. The alternative is offering before the person is ready and being dismissed and then not being available when the person finally reaches the point where they can hear you. I would rather wait and be useful than speak too soon and be ignored." Conrad looked at the machine for a long time. Then he said, "My great-grandfather built his company from a single piece of equipment in 20 years of work. He died when I was 12. I remember him as a man who never stopped working and who thought that the secret to everything was matching the right tool to the right job and then not getting out of the way of the work." Norval said, "That sounds about right." Conrad said, "I think I inherited the work part and lost the matching part somewhere in the middle years when the company got big enough that matching felt like a luxury we could afford to skip." Norval said, "Most men in your position do. You get large enough that you can substitute scale for judgment. More equipment, bigger machines, more horsepower. It works often enough that you stop checking whether it is the right approach or just the obvious one." Conrad said, "My great-grandfather was smarter than me." Norval looked at him. He said he was smarter than both of us. He built a world that worked. We just inherited it. The two men stood in the shed with that sentence in the air between them, and neither of them spoke for a moment, and the September morning moved outside the open door, and the machine stood between them, doing what machines do when they are not working, which is simply being what they are, patient and ready. Conrad wrote the check to the Clayton County Historical Society before he left, standing at the same toolbox where Norval kept his rags, writing it out properly and tearing it off and handing it over. He did not look at the amount before he tore it. He had decided on the amount when he was driving over, and he was not going to renegotiate it with himself. Norval took it and folded it and put it in the same pocket as the first one. Conrad said, "I will not forget what you did." Norval said, "Most people forget. Not because they mean to, just because the next problem arrives and the one before it gets smaller in the mirror." Conrad said, "Not this one." He said it the way a man says something when he means it completely and is not performing the meaning. Norval heard that quality in it and nodded. Conrad drove back to the job site and the morning went on. Now I want to tell you about the second thing which happened later on Thursday evening. Corbett Haskell had not called on Wednesday evening the way he had told himself he would. He had driven back to Waterloo and eaten dinner and sat in his house and found that the call kept not happening, not because he did not want to make it, but because he was not yet sure what he wanted to say. And making a phone call before you know what you want to say is a good way to have the wrong conversation. He drove to the farm Thursday afternoon. He arrived at 3 in the afternoon, which was late enough that Norval would have been in from the fields for an hour, which was when Norval typically went to the shed to attend to whatever the shed required. Corbett knew this. He had grown up on this farm, and the rhythms of it were still in him, even after 20 years away, not accessible in the way you access things you use regularly, but available when he looked for them. He parked in the lane and walked to the shed. Norval was at the machine doing the same kind of work he was always doing when Corbett came to the shed, the careful maintenance that had no particular urgency and no particular end. The ongoing attention of a man who understood that keeping a thing ready was not a project you completed, but a practice you continued. Corbett came into the shed and stood near the front of the case. Norval looked up. He did not look surprised. He said, "Corbett." Corbett said, "I was there yesterday at the site." Norval kept his hands on what he was working on. He said, "I know. Halverson called me. Corbett said I should have come in. Norval said you came when you were ready." Corbett stood with that for a moment. He looked at the machine, not the way he had looked at it in 1989, when what he had seen was an object occupying space and consuming resources and representing $15,000 that could be put to better use. He looked at it the way a man looks at something when the category it belongs to in his mind has been revised by evidence and the revision is still settling. He said, "I did not know it could do that." Norval set down what he was holding. He looked at his son. He said, "You never asked." 4 words. Not harsh, not gentle, just accurate. The 4 words that had been the true answer to everything Corbett had said in the kitchen in 1989. The answer that had not been findable then, because the evidence that would have made it comprehensible had not yet been available. Corbett heard them, the way you hear something when you have been partly expecting it, and it is still harder to receive than you thought it would be, the specific difficulty of a true thing arriving in the right moment after a long wait. He did not say anything immediately. He was doing what the moment required of him, which was receiving what had been said and letting it settle before responding to it. Then he said, "You are right." He looked at the machine. He said, "Will you show me? Not everything at once, but will you start?" Norval looked at him for a moment. The light in the shed had the quality of late afternoon, long and horizontal, coming through the gaps in the siding and landing in the particular way that light lands in a space that has been used for serious work for a long time. In that light, his son's face was the face of a man in his early 40s who had just crossed a threshold he had been standing at the edge of for 3 years. Norval said, "Come back Saturday. We will start with the ground, before we touch the machine. Before I explain the boiler or the chain or any of it, we will start with how you read what is underneath your feet before you put anything heavy on it." Corbett nodded. He put his hand on the side of the boiler. Not because he intended to and not because he was performing anything. Because it was there and the impulse arrived before the thought, the way certain impulses do, when a person is standing in a place that means something, and the meaning comes through the body before it comes through the mind. The iron was warm from the day's running. The warmth of it was different from the warmth of a surface that has been heated from outside. It was the warmth of something that had been working, the warmth that comes from the inside out, from a contained process that had been asked to do something and had done it. Corbett took his hand off the iron and walked back to his truck. When he got to the door of the shed, he stopped and looked back at his father, who had gone back to work. He said, "I should have asked sooner." Norval said, "You are asking now," and that was all. Corbett drove back to Waterloo, and Norval stayed in the shed until the light outside changed from afternoon to evening. And when the light changed, he covered the machine with his canvas, the way August had covered it and the way Everett had covered it, and he turned off the single bulb and walked back to the house. Now let me tell you about what came after, because the story does not end in 1992 and does not end in a machine shed on a Thursday evening, and the way it continues is worth telling. Corbett came back on Saturday. He came back the Saturday after that. Through the fall of 1992 and into the winter. In the following year, he came when he could, some months more than others, and Norval taught him the way Everett had taught Norval, which was not by explaining but by doing, by standing beside him and letting the work be the teacher, in the way that the work is always the better teacher when the person learning is willing to let it be. He started with the ground the way Norval had said he would. He showed Corbett how to press his boot heel into the soil before he committed equipment weight to it, how to read the surface water, how to look at the way certain grasses lay in certain conditions and understand what the water table was doing 6 inches below the surface. He showed him the clay layer on the north side of the swamp and explained how he had known it was there and why it mattered and what it meant for how you positioned a machine when the job was extraction rather than construction. He showed him the boiler and the throttle and the chain. He showed him how to build the fire the right way and why the right way mattered and what happened when you tried to shortcut it. He showed him the drive wheels and explained the cleats and what they were doing when the machine moved across ground that would swallow a modern tracked vehicle. By the spring of the following year, Corbett could fire the engine and run it through its basic operations. Not with his father's fluency and not with the accumulated confidence that only comes from decades of use, but competently, carefully, in the way of a man who has begun to learn something real and knows how much he does not yet know. The machine had a new set of hands on it. The Clayton County Historical Society used the donation money to begin construction on a building that would house their collection of steam-powered and early farm equipment that had been sitting in various stages of deterioration in farm sheds and machine barns across the county, and that would have continued deteriorating until it was beyond recovery without a proper space and proper funding. The building was dedicated in 1997. The Case 1912 was the centerpiece of the collection, not permanently, because Norval still kept it at the farm and still fired it monthly and still drove it to county fairs and steam shows and school demonstrations. But the Historical Society built a display for it with photographs from the swamp rescue and a short account of what had happened, and on that display was a plaque. The plaque read, "Case Steam Traction Engine 1912. This machine was built before the First World War and is still working. It has recovered modern equipment from situations that modern technology could not solve. Some things do not become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were built." Norval Haskell died in the spring of 2001. He was 82 years old and had farmed his land until the previous fall, and he died the way he had lived without making more of the fact than it required. Corbett had been coming to the farm regularly for nearly a decade by then, and knew the land and the machine and the rhythms of both well enough that the transition when it came was not a rupture but a continuation. At the funeral, which was larger than Norval would have predicted and about the right size for what he had actually been in the county, Conrad Farley came. He was 54 years old and still running his company, though with less of the certainty and more of the judgment that had been missing in 1992. He stood near the back and did not push himself into the family moments, and when it was over, he found Corbett and shook his hand. He said your father corrected me in a way I needed and could not have gotten any other way. Corbett said he had a gift for that. He did not do it often. When he did, it stayed. Conrad said it stayed. He looked toward where the case was visible at the edge of the property where Corbett had driven it from the farm to the church and back, the sound of it moving through the April morning, the way it had always moved, deliberate and patient, and carrying in it something that was not exactly memory, but was not entirely separate from memory either. The sound of a practice continued across generations. Conrad said, I told people this story for years, the swamp story. Some of them laughed at first, same way I laughed. Most of them stopped laughing when I finished. Corbett said what made them stop. Conrad said the same thing that made me stop. When you actually see it happen in front of you, when you watch a machine that should not be able to do the thing, and you have already seen everything else fail, there is nothing left to laugh at. There is just the fact. He said goodbye and drove back to his company and the work that was always waiting for him there. And he carried the fact with him the way he had carried it since 1992. Not as a story he told for its own sake, but as a correction that was still doing its work in his thinking. The case stayed in the shed on the Haskell farm. Corbett fired it monthly and maintained it the way it had always been maintained, carefully and with full attention, because the maintenance was not about the machine exactly, or not only about the machine. It was about keeping current the knowledge of what the machine could do, which was knowledge that did not stay current without use, which was knowledge that lived only in the person who worked with the machine, and that did when the working stopped. He fired it for his son when his son was old enough to understand what he was watching. He showed him the ground reading the same way Norval had shown him, starting with the soil and working toward the machine, because the machine without the ground knowledge was just iron, and the ground knowledge without the machine had nowhere to go, and together they were something that could not be bought and could not be recreated from documentation, and existed only in the chain of one person showing another across time. In 2015, 23 years after the swamp rescue, a piece of heavy equipment belonging to Conrad Farley's grandson went into the same swamp. The grandson was 30 years old and ran a section of the highway project that had been extended through Clayton County, a different phase of a road project that had been expanding incrementally since the 90s. He had grown up hearing the story of 1992, the way children grow up hearing family stories present enough to be familiar, distant enough to feel like history rather than instruction. He had been warned. His grandfather had told him specifically more than once about the ground along the eastern margin of the original job site, had told him the survey instruments were unreliable in that area, had told him to walk the margin before putting heavy equipment on it and to press his boot into the soil in the places the survey said were solid, and to see what the soil said back. The grandson had heard this advice. He had not disregarded it out of arrogance. He had not fully believed it because the survey equipment his company used was more sophisticated than what had been available in 1992 and had not flagged the area as problematic. And he had a schedule and a crew and the kind of confidence that comes from a run of years in which the modern approach has been reliable enough that the exceptions feel theoretical. The machine went in on a Tuesday morning. He stood at the edge of the swamp on Tuesday afternoon and thought about his grandfather and reached for his phone. Conrad was 71 years old and had sold the company 5 years earlier and was living the life of a retired man who found retirement more difficult than he had expected because he had organized too much of himself around the work for the absence of the work to sit easily. He answered on the second ring. His grandson told him what had happened, said he had a Caterpillar 390 in the swamp, and he had already arranged for recovery equipment to come in the morning, and he was calling because There was something he had heard from his grandfather many times and had not fully understood, and was beginning to think he might have missed something important. Conrad listened to all of it. Then he said, "Call Corbett Haskell." His grandson said, "The steam engine." Conrad said, "Yes." His grandson said, "Grandpa, that was 1992. We have better technology now." Conrad said, "And how did that work out for you so far today?" A silence on the phone. Then the grandson said, "About like you would expect." Conrad said, "Call Corbett before the recovery equipment gets there. Call him tonight so he has time to fire the engine in the morning." His grandson said, "You really think?" Conrad said, "I think I have been telling you this story since you were old enough to listen, and you heard it as a story, and I need you to hear it as information." Another silence. Then, "Yes, sir." Conrad hung up the phone and sat in his house and thought about a Wednesday morning in 1992 and a man on a platform and the specific sound of a steam whistle carrying across flat Iowa land and the way a piece of equipment that should not have been movable had moved inch by inch and then foot by foot and then free because the right knowledge had been maintained and the right machine had been kept ready and someone had waited the correct amount of time before offering what only they could offer. Corbett came the next morning. He was 65 years old and drove the case on its trailer to the site the same way his father had driven it in 1992, arriving at the kind of early that requires preparation done before dawn, the boiler at working pressure when the trailer pulled onto the access road. His son, who was 31 and who had been learning the machine for 8 years, came with him. The pull took 2 hours. The 390 was larger than the 375 had been in longer, and required 3 repositions of the chain and 2 adjustments to the position of the machine because the geometry of extraction was not fixed and required reading as you went. Corbett's son handled the chain. Corbett handled the machine. They worked without talking much because they had worked together long enough that the communication that mattered happened in the work itself, in the way one of them moved that told the other where to stand and what to check and when to be clear of the load line. When the 390 came free, the crew on site made the same kind of noise that crews make in these situations, the noise of relief mixed with astonishment, and Corbett shut the throttle and climbed down and checked the chain and then pulled the whistle cord. The sound went across the Iowa morning, the same way it had always gone, the same way August had heard it when the case was new, and the same way Everett had heard it, in the same way Norval had heard it across 40 years of working the machine, patient and deliberate and entirely indifferent to whether the occasion was historic or ordinary, because the machine did not distinguish between those categories. It had been asked to do a job. It had done it. That was the entirety of what it knew how to say. Conrad's grandson came over after the chain was unhooked and stood near Corbett and said, "My grandfather told me about your father." Corbett said, "I know. He told me about your grandfather." The grandson said, "My grandfather said your father saved more than his excavator. He said he saved him from a way of thinking that would have kept costing him money until he changed it." Corbett looked at the machine. He said, "That sounds like what my father would have done." The grandson said, "Your grandfather would have thought it was a big deal. Your father would not have." Corbett said, "My father thought it was just a job that needed doing, and he had the right equipment. The fact that everyone else thought it was impossible confused him a little. He never quite understood why you would laugh at an offer before you understood what was being offered. He said he never understood why you would close a door before you knew what was behind it." The grandson was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I understand it now. I understood it somewhere around 10 this morning when my recovery equipment did the same thing to this ground that your father's crane did in 1992. Corbett said, "You understand it the same way my father understood it, from the inside of having been wrong about it." He climbed back to the platform and started the case and drove it back toward the trailer and the county road and the farm where it lived. The sound of it went across the morning and then faded as the machine rounded the curve in the road, and the job site went back to being a job site, and the swamp was quiet. What have you kept that the room told you to let go of? What knowledge sits in your hands, or in your memory, or in some shed behind some barn, maintained across years, when no one asked for it, waiting for the day when everything that is newer and more expensive has already failed? Tell me in the comments, because I think there are more people keeping something worth keeping than have ever been asked the question, and I think the world runs on that keeping in ways we do not often acknowledge. August Haskell paid $3,200 for a machine in 1912 and told his family it would outlast all of them. He did not say that with certainty. He said it with belief. And belief, when you maintain it the way you maintain old iron, with monthly attention and seasonal use, and the willingness to pass it forward to the next set of hands, outlasts everything that ever laughed at it. The machine is still in the shed on the Haskell farm in Clayton County, Iowa. Corbett's son fires it every month. He presses his hands into the soil before he puts the machine on unfamiliar ground. He knows where the clay layer runs on the north side of the swamp. He knows how to read what is 6 inches below the surface from what the surface shows him. He knows how to hook a chain to a buried frame, and he knows what angle to pull from, and he knows how to feel through the platform when the load is at the limit and when it has more to give. He learned all of it the same way it has always been learned on that farm, by standing next to someone who knew and paying attention, and then doing it himself until the doing became knowing. The boiler can still hold working pressure. The steel cleats are still sound. The chain is still coiled in even loops on the drawbar, ready for the next job, whatever the next job turns out to be. It is 113 years old. It still does not know when to quit.